My name is Karen Garst. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. A little bit about my background. I have a PhD in education from the University of Wisconsin that I never used, but it was a fun time in the 70s, what can I say? And I've had several careers. I retired as executive director of the Oregon State Bar in 2008. I started to garden on my 5 acres and take care of the pets, and wrote a genealogy tracing my ancestry back to 1635. And then last summer, in July of 2014, the United States Supreme Court issued a decision in Burwell versus Hobby Lobby Incorporated that said, oh, based on Citizens United, Hobby Lobby's a corporation and they're really people, and so they have religious beliefs that say that they shouldn't have to provide birth control under Obamacare to their employees. And the court said, yeah, that's right. And it really upset me because I joined women's organizations in the 60s and 70s, and I thought we had birth control, the right to abortion, we got that handled. And that decision really troubled me, and I decided to write a book. And this book is a collection of essays of women and their journey away from religion. I have 17 of them. I sent the final manuscript off to the editor I hired. And of course, when you write a book, you can't just write a book. You have to do all this other stuff. So I started a blog. Would love to have you all as subscribers. It's www.faithlessfeminist.com. Let me tell you a little bit about the word feminine. It actually means less faith. Minus like minimum, fe meaning faith. So it was to a derogatory term for women to say, well, they don't have as much faith as men. So faithless feminist is kind of a doubling down on that. I also have a Facebook page if you'd rather have that, Faithless Feminist. I have a YouTube channel, Faithless Feminist. And my Twitter account I had before, so it's at Karen_Garst. So that's a little bit about me. And today I was asked to talk about women and atheism and some of the issues involved with that. So I'd like to go back a little bit into modern atheism. And we really, if we look at the 18th century, we see the Enlightenment. And that really was the start of the surge of what I would call modern atheism. And it fueled the American and French Revolution, and the French Revolution was very non-theist. In the United States in the 19th century, we had a very famous orator named Roger Ingersoll. And if you have an opportunity to read his speeches, they're really amazing. And he is credited with, because he did so much talking against religion, he's credited with kind of getting rid of the fire and brimstone, that the preachers had to back off from that a little. So we have the gains of that. And then women started in the anti-slavery movement as abolitionists. And they moved then on, actually they tried to couple it with, and it didn't work, but they started to move to the suffrage movement to gain the right to vote for women. And some of those, Frances Gage as an example, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's one of my favorites, Helen Gardner. I did a post several weeks ago on some of the quotations of her work. And it was pretty brave of those women to stand out and say they were atheists in the 19th century. So I wanted to be sure to give credit to them. In the 20th century, something fairly unique happened in the 50s. Because of the social programs under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the corporations were upset about those. So they started to look at ways of reducing them, and they made an alignment with what I would call evangelical Christians, Billy Graham, etc., and they approached President Eisenhower, who was supportive, and they got this coalition together. And this is the time when under God got put into the Pledge of Allegiance. In God we trust got to be the motto of the country and took over E Pluribus Unum. And this movement also gained momentum by being opposed to communism. So these things happened in the 50s, which really fueled, I think, the religious fervor in the United States. There is a book by Kevin Kruse called One Nation Under God that goes through this historically. It's a very good read. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who was probably one of the most famous women atheists in the 20th century, and she championed a lawsuit that outlawed Bible reading in the public schools. Previous to that, there was a lawsuit, I think the year before, that outlawed prayer in schools. And it earned her the sobriquet given to her by Life magazine of the most hated woman in America. So you go, Madeline. And then talked a little bit about the 60s, the turmoil of civil rights, the women's rights movement. In the 70s, women were starting to enter male-dominated professions. I know as a former director of the Oregon State Bar, many women, there had been women before, of course, but the numbers really started to increase in the 70s. And now there's about 50-50 in some law schools. There are more women enrolled than men. So we saw those changes. Then we're going to jump ahead to the new atheism, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Started out with Sam Harris's book, and I was at the Willamette Writers Conference in early August, pitching my book, of course. And the first person I pitched to said, "Oh yeah, I know the story of Sam Harris's book. It was really hard to get somebody to take it on. He was a graduate student when he wrote his first book." So he really started the path. Richard Dawkins, renowned scientist, entered the fray with several books. Christopher Hitchens, who's now passed away, and Daniel Dennett, they became known as the Four Horsemen. Horsemen, I might add there. And this was a much more militant atheism than we had seen before, that religion was actually harmful. And if you ever get a chance to see a debate by Christopher Hitchens, he's really an excellent speaker. So that's a very brief overview. Let's talk about statistics. In 2015, the Pew Report said that 3.1% of the population declared themselves to be atheists. Now, that's not a lot, but it's up from 1.6% in 2007. However, the majority of those, 60%, were men. So we see already in those who are willing to say they're atheist, a skew that has more men than women. I think another factor, the Four Horsemen came from fields that were dominated by men, science and philosophy. So those people, you know, in the 60s, 70s, 80s were building a career, and by the time, except for Sam Harris perhaps, were already pretty well known in their field. So somebody like Richard Dawkins takes on atheism, it's not as much a risk to them. They've already got an established career. And in philosophy in 2000, only 21% of the faculty were women. So you've got a situation where there are fewer women in those fields, where a lot of the atheists came from. And if you've ever been in academia, there's the tenure issue, there's people, it's very difficult to speak out if you're not pretty well established. Some other statistics, Fortune 500 companies, only 5% of the CEOs are women. Congress, 80% male. And religion, many denominations, including Catholicism and most Jewish sects, the priests and rabbis are male. So it's really not surprising that males dominate the field of atheism. I did a review for my marketing, and I went to Amazon, wrote atheism, sorted the books by those that received the most reviews just as a way to sort them. And I came up with 100 books. Only 6 of them were written by women. So we see definitely a disadvantage in that. So let's talk a little bit about the women in the movement. There are very many women who are involved in the atheist movement. I'm going to just name a few. You may be familiar with these. Annie Laurie Gaylor is the co-director of the Freedom from Religion Foundation based in Madison, Wisconsin. I had the opportunity to go to their convention in October because my husband and his buddies are going to Green Bay Packers. So I got invited along, and I'm going to go to the convention. Sarah Moorhead, who I had the opportunity to have at my house, she was going through Seattle and Portland. She is head of an organization called Recovering from Religion. And if you have an opportunity to look at that, they just started a hotline. So if you know somebody who's really struggling with leaving, you know, a fundamentalist sect or something like that, there's a 24-hour hotline and they can call and get some help. Noelle George is the executive director of Foundation Beyond Belief. a charitable organization. Rebecca Hensler founded Grief Beyond Belief, a support organization for people who are going through a loss in their family or elsewhere. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a Muslim woman who has really stepped out. She's now in the United States. She's written The Infidel and The Nomad, and she's a very good writer and very outspoken, and her life has been threatened a number of times. Mandissa Thomas is head of an organization called Black Nonbelievers. So we do have women, they just don't seem to be quite as prominent as these Four Horsemen and some of the others. There are a lot of bloggers and YouTubers who are women. And I would say, on my list, Greta Christina has been very active, particularly on LGBT issues. Jacqueline Glenn, who's got a comic streak in her that's very interesting. I've been corresponding with Christy Winters, who's an American in Germany, who does a video every week on just so many different subjects. She did a series of videos on Karen Armstrong's book and critiqued those chapter by chapter. So that might be somebody to look up. Jennifer McCrate, we're going to hear a little about her later. Vicki Garrison, who left the Quiverful movement, the one where have as many kids as you can. Rebecca Watson, we're going to come back to her in one of the controversies. And my favorite is Valerie Tirico. She's a psychologist in Seattle. She's got an excellent blog, very well-researched articles. Most of her articles get on Salon, Alternet, or some other publication, and her book is Trusting Doubt. Then, of course, there's authors, journalists, professors, and I'm not going to go into all of those. Debaters, however, I did a little survey on YouTube, and I would say it's about 95% men. Again, I'm not really sure whether debate is something that more men are comfortable with. I did, several months ago, contact several women authors and leaders and said, hey, we need to get more women debating up there. If you give me the name of somebody who's got the knowledge, I'll try to talk and convince them into it, and I didn't get any replies on that. So let's talk about some of the controversies. Well, there's one called Elevator Gate. In 2011, Rebecca Watson was at a conference in Europe, spoke on feminism. And in the middle of the night, she's in the elevator, waiting to go to a room, and this guy propositions her. You want to come to my room for a cup of coffee or a drink? And she tweeted the next day, somewhat humorously, I think, saying, guys, don't do that. Well, there was a lot of pushback. And in particular, Richard Dawkins said, quit whining. You have it really good. Think of the Muslim women. Think of the genital mutilation, etc. And then people pushed back against him for saying that. So this controversy, you can just Google Elevator Gate and you will see all about it. So that was unfortunate, but it shows you what happens when something like that happens. Then there was a movement in 2012 called Atheism Plus, where particularly women came to an atheist conference and said, we don't want to just talk about atheism. We want to talk about intersectionality, LGBT issues. We want to talk about poverty. We want to talk policies. We want it to be broader than just the issue of atheism. And somebody I mentioned earlier, Jan McCrete, who's a blogger, got that going, and it's kind of faded. There's a little piece of it left, but that didn't go very far. So those are a couple of the controversies that have occurred over the issue of men and women in atheism. I was asked in an interview recently, well, why are there fewer women? And I said, I haven't read any good research on that, but I do have some ideas. We've talked a little bit about if you're going to write a book, and you have a career in science or philosophy, you're probably going to have a little better chance of getting it published. And those are changing, but there's certainly more men in those. And if we look at religion itself, who are the leaders in the religion? There are a lot of religions where a woman couldn't be a pastor, couldn't be a lead of the church community, but what do women do? They do all the other work at churches. They teach Sunday school. They clean the altar. I'll tell you a funny story. My father was a deacon at Trinity Lutheran Church in Bismarck, North Dakota, and he told my mom, oh, the wives of the deacons are supposed to clean the church on Sunday. And she said, excuse me, I didn't sign up for that. I'm not going to do it. So I think he actually got stuck with going and doing it. But that's the way it was. This was quite some time ago. Choirs, music directors, particularly with the children, are often women. And I think the women in those situations are much more tied into a community. They're tied into other women that they work with. There's friends. And one of my authors said that when she and her husband left the church, they had a lot of friends there. None of them were friends after they said they were atheists. So I think there's a lot to lose, and maybe more for women. My 94-year-old mother-in-law still prepares the food for the funerals at her local Catholic parish. So they're involved. Another issue, Bertie and I tried to find two women who would debate the two of us on women in Christianity. And between the two of us, we emailed every woman who teaches at either a seminary or a university, whether it's private or public, in Oregon. 0. Not one of them would agree to debate us. So that says something there.
How many responded?
Pardon?
How many responded?
Well, I got mostly no's. I got oh, I'm sorry, I won't do that. I'm sorry, I'm busy. And you'd follow up, and they were busy again. And we had one person who said she'd meet with me for lunch and talk about it, and she hasn't gotten back to me after several reminders. So for any number of reasons, a real reluctance. So Bernie and I are planning to debate each other, and he's going to play the Christian apologist, and I get to play the atheist. We'll see how that goes. I recently read a story where an author who was pitching a book to a number of publishers decided to pitch it again with a man's name, and got responses from those literary agencies, no, I don't want to represent you, got a yes with a man's name on it. So there's clearly bias going on here. The other thing I would share in closing, Annie Laurie Gaylor, who's the head of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, told me, and she's been quoted in the press as saying, when people call and want somebody to debate, they ask for her husband, who's Dan Barker, who's written a book, who is a pastor who left Christianity. So we've got a lot of work to do there. When I decided to write this book, I put in Amazon, woman atheist. What do you think I got? The first page was t-shirts and a little pendant. So there aren't a lot of women writing about atheism. I wasn't able to find any book of personal essays, an anthology of people talking about their own experience. I did later find one that a woman in Seattle did, but it wasn't necessarily a move to atheism. There were little snippets of different experience. It was about women leaving extreme religions. And there were a few at the end, including Valerie Tirico, who were actually atheists, but I don't think she could have pitched that book as a group of atheists, agnostics, etc., which is what I'm doing. So I think more of us need to speak out, especially women, and encourage women to speak out about this issue, because I think when people look for a model, they often look for somebody who's their same gender. I know when I was growing up, if I would have met a woman who was a scientist, I think I would have been more likely to say, hey, that's for me, or somebody to maybe talk me into it. So I think this issue of having models of the same gender is really going to be important. And I hope to get the book published in the next few months, but would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to my blog. So I'm going to stop there and answer any questions you have. Let's get a dialogue going.
What are education levels of those women that you were writing about? I mean, the reason why I'm asking is I think that there is a lot of burden on top of overall people who want to leave religion. They have to deal with a lot of things, but I think that being able to sustain yourself and to make a living, and that's probably harder on women in general. So it would be interesting to know what is the...
Sure. Well, I can tell you a little bit about the 17 women. I started out with friends, And some of them said, absolutely, I'd love to write an essay. Some said, I'm an atheist, but I don't have time to write an essay. And then I started to go to different organizations. Bernie helped me from his group get some women who were willing to write. I went to the Humanists of Greater Portland, etc. And most of these women have, at the very least, a college degree. One of them was a top engineer at a local technology committee. So there's a variety, but I would say they're all pretty highly educated.
Okay.
And some of them have written before, and I am really amazed when you take, 17 women who aren't professional writers, how good the writing really is and how interesting it is. And some talk about something that happened that was really pivotal in their leaving religion. Some have more of a, here's how I got there over a long period of time. Some of them are very dramatic. Some of them had a lot of problems leaving, in particular, a fundamentalist religion. And really, one of my authors said she, over a period of years, wrote 100 pages just to try to process what she had learned after having left that religion and all the things that it did. Whether it's fear, whether it's guilt, whether it's shaming. And it's difficult to get over those issues, particularly when you learn those as a child. But I'm impressed with the writing. And because they are professional writers, I hired an editor who has gone through them, made changes, had gone back to the authors, and then the authors have sent those to me. And I just sent the final manuscript to the editor to be spelling, grammar, punctuation, etc. last week. So, yay! And now I'm, of course, continuing to pitch it to publishers.
I have a question.
Yes.
So as a woman in atheism, do you feel like the atheism movement is kind of hostile to women? I mean, do you feel like you're going against the current there, or is there anything like that?
Well, I think you have to be assertive, but I think that's pretty much true everywhere. I remember when I was in college, and I don't have that many experiences that I feel I was treated differently because I was a woman, but I applied for a scholarship to Dartmouth, and I was at a private Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, Lutheran College, and the only woman on the committee said, why should we give it to you? You'll just get pregnant, you'll just get married and have kids. I didn't get the scholarship, but I went on to get a PhD anyway, so there. I think, women who are successful in our fields, and particularly in those fields that aren't dominated by women, I think they've learned that. So I don't particularly I feel that people have been very welcoming. Certainly the organizations I've participated in, I've been invited to talk. I don't particularly feel that, but then I'm 65 and I've had a multitude of careers. I've learned how to be assertive and to speak out, so it doesn't really bother me. But I'm sure there are instances, just like there are in any workplace, where people don't feel as comfortable.
So what do you think is the biggest reason why, like you said, there was you looked at books on Amazon, there's 4 out of 100 or so that were from women?
6, yeah.
So what do you think the biggest problem is for women to be activated? I mean, what's the biggest problem holding the women back?
Well, I think one of the things that's really facilitated women speaking out is social media, because it takes a lot to write a book. I feel like I was herding cats for a year. And it's very difficult to get a book published. So I'm not really surprised. We talked about the fields people come from. If they're in science or philosophy, that's going to lend itself more. But I think the social media really give everyone the opportunity to do something that's less than that. As I mentioned, some of the bloggers who have been established for 10 years and longer, who put out things every day, who speak out about it. And there are people who do videos that you can see. They're just still the minority. But I think that's true, as I talked about, in the 70s when women started entering law school. The first ones who were there in 1920, boy, they were blazing the trail. And that's always the hardest part. Well, as you start to get to the 70s, and now with 50% of the people in law school being women, it gets easier. So I think that's going to change with atheism as well. Greta Christino, I've mentioned several times, put out an article that said there are more atheists than Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. Hello, and here's a list. So I think that's changing. And if you think that it was just 2004 where we had this resurgence of atheism with the Four Horsemen, that's not a lot of time. So I'm hopeful. I'll even be more hopeful when I get my book published. Yes?
Do you think that there's any negative impact from all of the internet activity and the social media activity? Because I do feel like, and I don't know if there are studies to prove this, that you often get more negative reaction to women on the internet. So isn't there a certain amount of risk for a woman blogging, posting debates? I wonder if that maybe influenced some of the people who are reluctant. Because you know you're going to get, I mean, Ion here, CLE gets the death threats, right? Everybody gets this negative pushback, and the men do too, but there may be an imbalance in terms of how much pushback everybody gets.
Yes, and I think if you're going to speak out as one of that 3.1% atheism, you're going to get pushback. But you're going to get the other as well. My sister, who started out last year by telling me she wasn't an atheist, she was agnostic, now she forwards my Facebook pages and she comments on things. I mean, she's really gotten more active on the issue. So, sometimes it takes time. There's a lot of trolling. You got to have a tough skin. If you're going to be on Twitter, you got to say, I'm going to laugh about this. I'm not going to be sad about it. I think in the case of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she has been very courageous because as a former Muslim woman, she really has received a number of death threats. So I think it's more difficult.
Isn't that pretty much same as in everyday life, right? I mean, there is a lot of abuse towards women, in general. The internet just gives that anonymity cloak to everybody, so you have all kind of crazy people feel free to do whatever they may not be able to do, in real life.
That could be as well.
So you're unfortunate. I mean, that's the unfortunate side of it, and it could be probably pretty, upsetting for people to get exposed to that type of.
I think that's absolutely true.
Messaging.
I neglected to mention that I also wrote an appendix last year. When the Hobby Lobby decision came out, I had read a lot of the books from the Jesus Seminar in the 90s, but I probably read, 60, 80 books last year to increase my knowledge on that. And I wrote an appendix for the book that's a little more scholarly. It's a subjugation of women in the Bible and Christianity. And I've been, trying to put some of those issues out on my blog, whether it's I think if I were in a debate with a Christian apologist who is a woman and she said, why are you an atheist? I could say, Eve. And maybe that would be the end of it. I mean, just imagine all the things that have been done to women from that one story. And my response is, I'm not going to believe in a God that makes women responsible for sin. It's not going to happen. And the childbirth. Thank you very much for pain in childbirth. There was even a case, I want to say the 19th century, where they wanted to deny women anesthesia because of that biblical passage. To say nothing about the Malleus Maleficarum and the killing of the witches and just about everything else that happened. So I think, in my view, women have an even better reason to leave religion than men do because they've been subjugated because of it. Look at even today, the fight we have about abortion rights is based on men saying, no, you can't control your own body. And they're using the Bible to support them on that.
To accentuate a little bit about the previous question, for women who have a media presence, is there the additional hurdle that, if you're a guy, if you're a woman, they also have a lot more comments too about your appearance, your hair is ugly or you're fat or whatever. But if you're a guy, they're not going to judge them so much by their appearance. So does a woman have another extra thickness of skin she has to have to tolerate those extra things that a guy wouldn't have to go through, you think?
Well, we would probably have to leave to another day the issue of sexism in our culture because that's a pretty broad topic. I think that's true. And I think but there's some things that are very interesting. I have some friends who are in their 20s who are women who are very outspoken. And not willing to accept that subjugation, not willing to accept that conversation, and really standing out. So I have a lot of faith in the millennials. And I think women are getting more assertive in the ability to do that as they speak up. But it certainly is a factor. You're not going to have, everyone is going to not feel comfortable being controversial. There are a lot of people, men and women, who don't want to get in the middle of a controversy. I'll read the book, but I don't want to talk about it. Or, yeah, I have those opinions, and I'll talk to you privately about it, but I don't want to be interviewed about it. I don't want to debate, etc. So I think that's pretty typical.
Yeah, I mean, like even the presidential debate, Donald Trump was making fun of Carly, her face, and then later on apologized or tried to change it, and then Rand Paul confronted him on it, and he goes, "Well, I have plenty of material with you too, but I'm not saying anything." So it's kind
You're
of
ugly too.
Yeah, it's kind of funny.
Yeah, that was kind of interesting. Yeah.
I think it's actually interesting because I actually think that is a good thing. That finally people, they don't just kind of keep quiet and then do, direct policy and everything else, to damage the, overall prosperity and everybody else. At least this time, they go out there, they say what they mean, and even people maybe not be comfortable opposing them or being part of discussion. You make little internal note that says this is just moron, and
Yes.
I'm just.
And he got a lot of
eventually-
pushback from his comments about Megyn Kelly.
I mean, I'm just
and
using
Carly
him as an
Fiorina.
example because
Mhm.
I mean
Yeah.
he was in that state for quite a long time now, right? So that's nothing new for him. But I think in general in politics, people eventually show their real colors, and then eventually they get flushed out, and eventually I think the reason why so many percentages of increase of atheism or non-religious people they're just simply saying, those are just, I don't want to do anything with those guys.
But like on Facebook and Twitter and stuff, I mean, people will make those kind of comments, and other
Correct.
people, they're a jerk, but then other people pile on there. There's more jerks that pile on to them too,
And that's
so
perfectly
you
fine.
have to absorb all that.
No, I
and delete it or whatever.
completely agree. It's not easy,
Yeah.
but at least you know what's going on, and eventually there is that self-correcting mechanism that can work only if you know what's going on. If they're quiet and nobody says anything, but everything is kind of assumed, in God we trust. Well, we don't agree, but it's assumed it should be there, so just kind of move on along. And at the same time, they enact policies and laws and everything else that kind of keeps everything status quo that is, oppressing. This way, at least, put it on the table, and it won't be kind of ugly for some time, but eventually, people. I agree with you. I believe in that positive energy. People are rational by nature.
And I have had a good experience on Twitter and Facebook. I've had on my Facebook page, because I do advertising in terms of boosting the posts through Facebook, I've had several people pray for me and have added that to the comment section. Fine. But pretty much everybody's been pretty respectful. I haven't gotten trolled yet, knock on wood.
Wait till you publish.
Any other questions? Well, thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it. It was fun.
Thank you.
Thanks.